The October wind swept across the Kansas plains like a mournful hymn, carrying with it the scent of dying grass and distant wood smoke. Sarah McKenna stood on the weathered porch of her small homestead, her calloused hands gripping the splintered rail as she watched the sun bleed crimson across the endless horizon. 3 months had passed since they'd buried Thomas in the rocky ground behind the barn. 3 months since the fever had taken him and left her alone with nothing but 40 acres of stubborn earth and a silence so deep it made her bones ache. The rifle leaning against the doorframe caught the last rays of sunlight, its metal barrel cold and foreign to her touch. Thomas had always handled the gun, had always been the one to drive off the wolves that came sniffing around their livestock, the drifters who sometimes appeared at their door with hungry eyes and dangerous intentions. Now the weapon felt like a stranger in her home, necessary but terrifying, a reminder of all the things she didn't know how to do in this harsh, unforgiving land. A dust cloud appeared on the distant trail, growing larger as it approached her property. Sarah's heart quickened as she recognized the familiar figure of Jake Donovan, the cowboy who worked the cattle spread 3 miles east. He rode with the easy grace of a man born to the saddle, his weathered hat pulled low against the setting sun, his horse's hooves drumming a steady rhythm against the hard-packed earth. Jake had been Thomas's friend, one of the few neighbors who'd helped them through that first brutal winter when the snows had piled higher than the barn roof and the cold had crept through every crack in their cabin walls. He'd brought them supplies when their own ran low, had helped Thomas mend fences and chase down strayed cattle. Since the funeral, he'd ridden by every few weeks, always finding some excuse to check on her welfare, always careful to maintain a respectful distance that spoke of both kindness and propriety. As he drew near, Sarah smoothed her worn dress and tucked a strand of auburn hair behind her ear. There was something different about his visit today, something in the way he sat his horse, in the deliberate slowness of his approach. When he finally reined in before her porch, his blue eyes held a gravity that made her stomach tighten with apprehension. "Evening, Mrs. McKenna," he said, touching the brim of his hat with fingers that bore the scars of rope burns and hard work. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all, Jake. You're always welcome here." She gestured toward the single chair on her porch. "Would you care to sit a spell? I could put some coffee on." He dismounted with fluid motion, but instead of accepting her invitation, he stood at the foot of her porch steps, his expression troubled. "Ma'am, I'm afraid I've got some news that might concern you. Word came down from Dodge City this morning about a gang of cattle rustlers working their way south through the territory. They hit the Morrison place last night, took near 100 head and burned the barn for good measure." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. The Morrison spread was only 20 miles north, close enough that these men could easily reach her property within a day's ride. Were the Morrisons hurt? Old Pete took a bullet in the shoulder, but he'll mend. His boys fought them off before they could do worse damage. Jake's jaw tightened. "These aren't common thieves, Mrs. McKenna. They're organized, ruthless, the kind of men who wouldn't think twice about harming a woman alone." The weight of her isolation pressed down upon her like a physical burden. 40 acres might as well have been 400, for all the help she could expect from distant neighbors. Her closest friend, Martha Brennan, lived 15 miles away in Clearwater, too far to be of any immediate assistance if trouble came calling. "What would you advise?" she asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Jake removed his hat, running weathered fingers through hair the color of sun-bleached leather. "I'd feel a lot better if you came to stay with the Brennans in town until this passes. Or," he hesitated, his gaze shifting to the rifle by her door, "I could teach you to use that Winchester properly. Thomas mentioned once that you'd never had cause to learn." The offer hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Sarah had watched her husband clean and load the rifle countless times, had seen him bring down deer and drive off predators with casual efficiency, but the weapon itself had always seemed too heavy, too complicated, too dangerous for her to handle. The few times Thomas had suggested she learn to shoot, she'd found excuses to avoid the lessons, content to leave such matters in his capable hands. Now those hands were cold in the ground, and the rifle represented the thin line between her survival and the wolves that circled not just her livestock, but her very life. "I can't abandon the homestead," she said finally. "Thomas worked too hard to build this place. If I run now, there'll be nothing left to come back to." She looked at the rifle again, then met Jake's eyes with newfound resolve. "I'd be grateful if you'd teach me to shoot." Something shifted in his expression, a mixture of respect and concern that made her pulse quicken in ways that had nothing to do with fear. "It's not easy learning, ma'am. Takes patience and practice to become truly proficient. Then we'd better start soon." Jake nodded slowly, settling his hat back on his head. "I'll come by tomorrow morning, if that suits you. Bring some ammunition and targets." He mounted his horse with practiced ease, then looked down at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Mrs. McKenna, I want you to know that whatever happens, you won't face it alone. There are still good people in this world, people who believe in helping their neighbors." As he rode away into the gathering dusk, Sarah remained on her porch long after the sound of hoofbeats had faded into the distance. The prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, vast and beautiful, and utterly indifferent to human suffering. But for the first time since Thomas's death, she didn't feel quite so small beneath its infinite sky. Tomorrow, she would learn to defend herself. Tomorrow, she would take the first step toward becoming the kind of woman who could survive in this harsh land without a man's protection. But tonight, as she carried the rifle inside and tried not to think about the dangerous men who might already be riding toward her door, she allowed herself to remember the way Jake Donovan's eyes had held hers, the quiet strength in his voice, when he'd promised she wouldn't face the future alone. Dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of gold and amber when Jake's horse appeared on the horizon, carrying him toward Sarah's homestead with the steady purpose of a man who kept his promises. Sarah had been awake since before sunrise, her stomach tight with nervous energy as she prepared for her first shooting lesson. She'd changed clothes 3 times before settling on her most practical dress, dark blue wool that wouldn't show powder burns, and had braided her hair back severely to keep it from interfering with her aim. The rifle felt heavier in her hands than she'd remembered as she carried it out to meet him. Jake dismounted near the barn, where he'd set up a rough shooting range the evening before, using hay bales to support wooden targets he'd carved from old fence posts. The morning air was crisp and still, perfect conditions for learning to shoot, though Sarah could barely hear his initial instructions over the thundering of her own heartbeat. "The most important thing to remember," Jake said, his voice patient and measured, "is that a firearm is only as dangerous as the person holding it. Respect the weapon, understand its capabilities, and it becomes a tool rather than a threat." He demonstrated the proper way to hold the Winchester, his hands sure and steady as he showed her the correct stance. Feet shoulder-width apart, body angled slightly toward the target. The rifle should feel like an extension of your arm, not a burden you're struggling to control. When Sarah attempted to mimic his position, the rifle's weight immediately threw off her balance. She stumbled slightly, embarrassed by her clumsiness, but Jake was there instantly, his hands gently correcting her grip without making her feel foolish. His touch was brief and entirely proper, yet she found herself acutely aware of his nearness, the scent of leather and horses that clung to his clothes, the quiet confidence that seemed to radiate from him like heat from a well-tended fire. "Like this," he murmured, adjusting the position of her left hand on the rifle's forestock. "The weapon should rest naturally in your shoulder pocket. Don't fight it, let it settle where it wants to be." The first few shots were disasters. The rifle's recoil knocked Sarah back a step each time, leaving her shoulder aching and her target completely untouched. Frustration crept into her voice as she reloaded, her hands shaking with effort and embarrassment. But Jake never showed impatience, never made her feel inadequate for her lack of skill. Instead, he adjusted her stance incrementally, teaching her to lean into the rifle rather than away from it, to breathe properly and squeeze the trigger rather than jerking it. By the 4th shot, she managed to hit the outer edge of the target. The sound of the bullet striking wood brought a surprised laugh bubbling up from her throat, the first genuinely joyful sound she'd made since Thomas's death. Jake's smile in response was like sunshine breaking through storm clouds, transforming his weathered features and making him look years younger. "That's the way of it," he said, genuine pleasure evident in his voice. "You've got steady hands and good instincts. The rest is just practice." They continued through the morning, Jake patiently correcting her form, sharing stories of his own early struggles with marksmanship to ease her frustration when shots went wide. He'd learned to shoot as a boy on his father's ranch in Texas, he told her, back before the war had scattered his family to the 4 winds and left him to make his own way in the world. There was a sadness in his eyes when he spoke of those lost days, a longing for something that could never be reclaimed. "What brought you to Kansas?" Sarah asked during a break, as they shared water from his canteen and gave her aching shoulder a rest. "Same thing that brings most men west, I reckon," he replied, gazing out at the endless prairie. "The promise of something better." A chance to start over where the past doesn't follow so close behind. He looked at her then, his blue eyes serious. Thomas mentioned once that you folks came from Ohio. Must have been hard, leaving everything familiar behind. Sarah nodded, remembering those first overwhelming days when the vastness of the prairie had seemed like an ocean in which she might drown. Thomas had such dreams about this place. He could see it all in his mind. The crops we'd grow, the cattle we'd raise, the children who'd run through these fields. Her voice caught slightly. He never lived to see any of it come true. Dreams don't die with the dreamer, Jake said quietly. They just wait for someone else brave enough to pick them up and carry them forward. The intensity in his voice made her look at him more closely, seeing past the polite neighbor facade to the man beneath. There were depths to Jake Donovan that she'd never noticed before. Layers of experience and wisdom that spoke of struggles overcome and losses endured. When had she stopped seeing him merely as Thomas's friend, and begun to notice the way afternoon light caught the silver threads in his brown hair, the strength in his hands, the kindness that tempered his natural reserve? The afternoon brought improvement in her shooting, and with it, a growing sense of accomplishment that surprised her with its intensity. Each bullet that found its mark represented more than mere marksmanship. It was proof that she could learn, could adapt, could become something more than the helpless widow she'd believed herself to be. When Jake finally declared the lesson complete, 5 of her last 10 shots had hit the target, and her confidence had grown with each successful attempt. You'll want to practice every day, he advised as they cleaned the rifle together, his hands guiding hers through the process of removing powder residue and checking the action. Shooting is like riding or roping. The skills fade if you don't use them regularly. Will you come back tomorrow? The words escaped before she could stop them, more eager than she'd intended. Heat rose in her cheeks, but Jake's expression showed no judgment. Only understanding. If you'd like me to, yes. It'll take time to make you truly proficient, and with those rustlers still in the territory, time might be something we don't have much of. As he prepared to leave, Sarah found herself reluctant to see him go. The day had passed more quickly than any since Thomas's death, filled with purpose and companionship that had eased the constant ache of loneliness. When Jake mounted his horse, she stood watching until he disappeared into the distance, the rifle cradled in her arms like a promise of the strength she was slowly learning to claim. That night, as she cleaned and loaded the Winchester before placing it beside her bed, Sarah reflected on the changes a single day had wrought. This morning she'd been afraid of the weapon, intimidated by its weight and complexity. Now it felt familiar in her hands, a tool she was beginning to understand rather than fear. More surprisingly, she found herself looking forward to tomorrow's lesson with an anticipation that had little to do with marksmanship and everything to do with the quiet cowboy who'd shown her that even in her darkest hour, she wasn't truly alone. The second day brought rain, a steady drizzle that turned the prairie into a canvas of muted grays and browns. Sarah watched from her kitchen window as Jake approached through the gloom, his oilskin coat glistening with moisture, his horse's hooves splashing through puddles that reflected the leaden sky. She'd been up since before dawn, baking bread and brewing coffee with more care than she'd taken in months, though she refused to examine too closely her reasons for wanting everything to be perfect. "Morning, Mrs. McKenna," Jake called as he led his horse into the barn, seeking shelter from the persistent rain. "Might be we should move today's lesson indoors, unless you're fond of learning to shoot in a downpour." Sarah had anticipated this possibility, had already cleared a space in the barn where they could practice dry firing techniques without wasting ammunition. The enclosed space felt intimate in a way the open prairie hadn't, filled with the warm scents of hay and leather, and the comfortable sounds of horses moving in their stalls. When Jake removed his wet coat, Sarah found herself noticing details she'd missed before, the way his shirt stretched across his shoulders, the careful precision with which he handled the rifle, the small scar above his left eyebrow that spoke of some long-ago accident or altercation. "Today we'll work on sight alignment," he explained, showing her how to line up the rifle's front and rear sights with mathematical precision. Most folks think shooting is about luck or instinct, but it's really about consistency. Same stance, same grip, same sight picture every time. They stood close together as he guided her through the motions, his breath warm against her ear as he corrected her form. Sarah tried to concentrate on his instructions, but found herself distracted by his proximity, by the solid warmth of his presence beside her. When his hand covered hers to adjust her grip on the stock, she felt a flutter of sensation that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with awakening awareness. "You're trembling," he observed, his voice gentle with concern. "Are you cold?" "No," she whispered, then cleared her throat and spoke more firmly. "No, I'm fine. Please, continue." But Jake stepped back slightly, creating distance between them that felt both respectful and somehow disappointing. "Maybe we should take a break," he suggested. "Have some of that coffee I smell brewing." They sat on hay bales, sharing the coffee Sarah had prepared and talking quietly while the rain drummed against the barn roof. The conversation flowed more easily than it had the day before, touching on subjects both mundane and profound. Jake spoke of his plans to expand his small spread, to maybe raise horses alongside cattle if he could scrape together enough capital. Sarah found herself describing dreams she'd shared with Thomas, plans for a vegetable garden, and perhaps a few chickens. Simple ambitions that had seemed impossibly grand when viewed from their modest beginning. "Thomas used to say we'd have a dozen children running around this place," she said, surprised by her ability to speak of her late husband without the sharp pain that usually accompanied such memories. He came from a big family himself. Always wanted to recreate that here. "And what did you want?" Jake asked, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. It was a question no one had ever asked her, not even Thomas. Her wants had always been secondary to her husband's dreams, her role to support and nurture rather than to desire for herself. But sitting in the quiet barn with rain falling softly outside, she found herself considering possibilities she'd never dared to voice. "I wanted to matter," she said finally, "to be more than just someone's wife or someone's mother. I wanted to know that I could survive, could thrive, could contribute something meaningful to the world." She looked down at her hands, surprised by her own honesty. "Thomas was a good man, but he saw me as something fragile, something to be protected rather than trusted with real responsibility." "You're not fragile," Jake said quietly. "Yesterday proved that. Today's proving it again." The certainty in his voice made her look up, meeting his gaze directly. There was something in his eyes that made her breath catch, an appreciation that went beyond mere respect to something deeper and more complex. For a moment, the air between them seemed charged with possibility, heavy with unspoken recognition of the attraction growing between them. Then thunder rumbled overhead, breaking the spell and reminding them both of the world beyond the barn walls. Jake cleared his throat and stood, setting aside his empty coffee cup. "Rain's letting up some. We might be able to get in some actual shooting before I need to head back." The afternoon passed in a blur of instruction and practice, Sarah's accuracy continuing to improve as her confidence grew. But underlying the technical aspects of their lesson was an awareness that had nothing to do with marksmanship. She found herself noticing the way Jake's eyes crinkled when he smiled, the patient kindness he showed when she made mistakes, the casual strength with which he handled tasks that challenged her own capabilities. When he prepared to leave, Jake hesitated at the barn door, seeming to wrestle with words he couldn't quite speak. Finally, he turned to face her, his expression serious. "Mrs. McKenna, I hope you won't think me forward, but I feel obliged to say something." He removed his hat, running fingers through his hair in a gesture she was beginning to recognize as a sign of nervousness. "These lessons, spending time with you, it's become the brightest part of my days. I know it's too soon, know you're still grieving, but I needed you to know that my interest in your welfare goes beyond mere neighborly concern." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat, a flush of warmth spreading through her chest at his carefully chosen words. She'd sensed the growing connection between them but hadn't dared to name it, hadn't allowed herself to consider what it might mean for her future. "Jake," she began, then stopped, uncertain how to respond to such honest confession. Part of her wanted to encourage him, to admit that she looked forward to his visits with an eagerness that had surprised her. But another part, the part still bound by grief and propriety, urged caution. "I don't expect an answer," he said quickly, settling his hat back on his head. "Just wanted you to know where I stand. I'll be back tomorrow if you'll have me, for the shooting lessons and to whatever else develops in its own time." After he left, Sarah remained in the barn long after full darkness fell, the rifle forgotten in her hands as she replayed their conversation. 3 months ago, she'd been a grieving widow with no prospects beyond mere survival. Now she was learning to shoot, learning to defend herself, and perhaps most surprisingly, learning that her heart wasn't as frozen as she'd believed. The rain had stopped, and through the open barn door, she could see stars beginning to appear between the breaking clouds. Somewhere out there, Jake Donovan was riding home through the darkness, carrying with him the burden of his own honesty and the hope that she might someday return his growing affection. For the first time since Thomas's death, Sarah allowed herself to imagine a future that might hold more than simple endurance. It was a dangerous thought, full of complications and potential heartbreak. But as she finally made her way back to the empty house, she found herself looking forward to tomorrow with something that felt remarkably like hope. The third morning dawned clear and cold, with frost painting delicate patterns on the cabin windows and the prairie grass crackling underfoot. Sarah had risen early to tend her small garden, harvesting the last of the autumn vegetables before the first hard freeze could claim them. She was kneeling among the pumpkin vines when she heard the sound of multiple horses approaching, their hoofbeats drumming against the hard ground with ominous purpose. Rising quickly, she shaded her eyes against the morning sun and felt her blood turn to ice. 3 riders approached at a steady gallop, their faces hidden beneath the brims of worn hats, their postures radiating the casual menace of men accustomed to taking whatever they wanted. Even at a distance, she could see the rifles slung across their saddles, the predatory way they surveyed her property as they drew near. These were not neighbors come calling. Sarah's hand moved instinctively to the Winchester she'd taken to carrying with her during outdoor chores. The weight of the rifle, once foreign and frightening, now felt reassuring in her grip. 3 days of lessons with Jake had taught her the basics of marksmanship, but she was still far from expert. Could she defend herself against 3 armed men? Did she have any choice but to try? The riders reined in before her cabin, their horses snorting and stamping with barely contained energy. The man in the center, clearly their leader, was tall and lean with the weathered face of someone who'd spent years under the harsh prairie Sunday. His eyes were pale gray, cold as winter ice, and when he smiled, it held no warmth whatsoever. "Morning, ma'am," he said, touching his hat brim in a mockery of politeness. "Name's Wade Collins. These are my associates, Mr. Perry and Mr. Jenks." The 2 men flanking him were cut from similar cloth, hard-faced and dangerous, the kind of men who made their living through violence and intimidation. "What can I do for you, gentlemen?" Sarah kept her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. The rifle remained at her side, not quite threatening but clearly visible. Collins's smile widened, revealing teeth stained brown with tobacco. "See, we're in the cattle business, and we understand you might have some stock for sale. Thought we'd make you an offer." Sarah's few head of cattle grazed in the pasture beyond the barn, hardly enough to interest legitimate buyers. These men weren't here to purchase livestock. They were here to steal it, and her refusal would likely result in violence. But giving in to their demands would leave her with nothing, unable to survive the coming winter. "I'm sorry, but my cattle aren't for sale," she said, raising the Winchester slightly. "Perhaps you gentlemen should try the Morrison place. I hear they have stock to spare." Collins's expression darkened at the mention of the Morrison name, confirming Sarah's suspicion that these were the same rustlers who'd raided her neighbors to the north. Perry, a stocky man with suspicious bulges beneath his coat that suggested hidden weapons, spat into the dust. "Now that's unfriendly, lady. Here we are, making you a generous offer, and you're pointing that rifle at us like we're common thieves. Aren't you?" Sarah asked, her finger moving closer to the trigger. The tension stretched taut as a bowstring. Collins' hand drifted toward the pistol at his hip, while his companion spread out slightly, trying to create multiple angles of attack. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, but her grip on the Winchester remained steady. Jake's lessons had taught her more than marksmanship. They'd given her confidence in her own capabilities. "You know, boys," Collins said conversationally, "I think this little lady might be more trouble than she's worth. Maybe we should just take what we came for and be on our way. Maybe you should just ride on," a new voice suggested from behind them. All heads turned to see Jake Donovan approaching on horseback, his own rifle resting across his saddle pommel with deceptive casualness. But Sarah could see the deadly seriousness in his eyes, the coiled tension in his posture that suggested he was ready for immediate violence. "Well, well," Collins drawled, though some of the confidence had drained from his voice. "Another hero come to rescue the damsel in distress. How touching." "I'd say the lady was doing fine on her own," Jake replied, never taking his eyes off the 3 men. "But she's got friends who take a dim view of uninvited guests, particularly the kind who make their living stealing from honest folks." Perry's hand moved toward his gun, but froze when Jake's rifle swung to cover him with fluid precision. "I wouldn't," Jake advised quietly. I'm not as patient as Mrs. McKenna, and my rifle's got a hair trigger. For a moment, violence hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire. Then Collins raised his hand slightly, a gesture that might have been surrender or simply pragmatism in the face of superior positioning. No need for unpleasantness, he said, his tone conciliatory despite the fury burning in his pale eyes. We'll be moving on. Find more. Cooperative. Sellers elsewhere. Good idea, Jake agreed. And boys, if I hear of you troubling any more folks in this territory, I'll make it my personal business to track you down. That's not a threat, it's a promise. Collins gathered his reins, his smile now edged with genuine malice. This isn't over, cowboy. We'll be seeing you again real soon. Looking forward to it, Jake replied with a calmness that was somehow more menacing than any threat. The three rustlers wheeled their horses and rode away at a gallop, leaving a cloud of dust and the lingering stench of menace. Sarah watched until they disappeared over a distant rise, only then allowing herself to lower the Winchester with shaking hands. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the whisper of wind through the grass. Jake dismounted and approached her with careful steps, as if she were a spooked horse that might bolt at any sudden movement. You did fine, he said, his voice warm with admiration. Held your ground, kept your weapon ready, didn't let them intimidate you. Thomas would have been proud. At the mention of her late husband, Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. Not tears of grief, but of gratitude and relief, and something deeper that she wasn't ready to name. Without conscious thought, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Jake's waist, pressing her face against his chest and allowing herself to draw strength from his solid presence. For a moment, he stood rigid with surprise. Then his arms came around her, holding her gently but firmly while she trembled with the aftermath of fear and adrenaline. She could hear his heartbeat through his shirt, steady and strong, a sound more comforting than any words he might have spoken. It's all right, he murmured against her hair. You're safe now. They won't be back, not while I'm around to prevent it. When she finally pulled back, Sarah saw something in Jake's eyes that made her breath catch. It was more than concern, deeper than friendship, a tenderness that spoke of feelings carefully held in check. And for the first time since Thomas's death, she found herself wanting to lean into that warmth, to explore the possibilities it represented. How did you know to come? She asked. Saw their tracks this morning when I was checking my north fence line, he replied. 3 horses, riding hard and heading in this direction. Figured it was worth investigating. What if you hadn't come? What if? But I did come, he interrupted gently, and you were handling yourself just fine before I arrived. Don't underestimate what you accomplished today, Sarah. You faced down 3 dangerous men and didn't back down. That takes courage. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and hearing it on his lips sent warmth spreading through her chest. She looked at this man who'd appeared in her life like an answer to prayers she'd never dared to pray. This quiet cowboy who'd shown her how to defend herself, and then arrived like a guardian angel when she needed him most. Jake, she began, then stopped, uncertain how to voice the gratitude that filled her heart to overflowing. I know, he said softly. I know. The encounter with the rustlers changed something fundamental between Sarah and Jake, stripping away the last pretenses of mere neighborly concern and leaving them both aware of deeper currents. In the days that followed, their shooting lessons took on new urgency, but also new intimacy. Jake's hands lingered longer when correcting her stance, his voice grew gentler when offering instruction, and Sarah found herself watching him with growing appreciation for qualities she'd been too grief-stricken to notice before. A week after the confrontation, Jake arrived to find Sarah practicing alone, her shots grouped tightly in the center of the target. He watched from the barn doorway as she reloaded with smooth efficiency, her movements confident and sure. When she fired again, the bullet struck dead center, and Jake's whistle of admiration made her turn with a bright smile that transformed her entire face. I've been practicing, she said, lowering the rifle with obvious pride. I can see that. You've become quite the markswoman. He approached the target, examining the tight pattern of bullet holes with professional interest. Thomas was right about you having steady hands. With skills like these, you could enter the shooting competitions at the county fair. Perhaps I will, next year. The words surprised them both with their implication of planning for the future, of believing she would still be here, still be fighting and thriving. When spring arrived, they stood facing each other in the afternoon sunshine, the weight of unspoken feelings heavy between them. Sarah had been thinking about Jake constantly, had found herself looking forward to his visits with an eagerness that had nothing to do with firearms instruction. More than once, she'd caught herself imagining what it would be like to share her days with someone again, to have a partner in building the dreams Thomas had begun. Sarah, Jake said quietly, his use of her first name now natural between them. There's something I need to tell you. Those rustlers haven't left the territory. Word came down from Dodge City that they hit the Patterson spread yesterday, made off with 50 head and left the barn burning. Fear clutched at Sarah's chest. The Patterson place was only 10 miles away, close enough that Collins and his men could easily return to her property. What should we do? Sheriff's forming a posse to track them down, but it might take days or even weeks to find their hideout. In the meantime, Jake hesitated, then forged ahead with determination. I want you to come stay at my place. You'd be safer there, and I'd sleep better knowing you weren't out here alone. The invitation hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond simple safety concerns. Sarah understood what he was offering, understood also what acceptance might mean for both of them. An unmarried woman staying at a bachelor's ranch would set tongues wagging throughout the territory, regardless of the circumstances. I can't abandon the homestead, she said finally. This is my home, Jake. Thomas and I built it together, and I won't let fear drive me away. Then I'll stay here, he replied without hesitation. Sleep in the barn, keep watch. Those rustlers won't catch you defenseless again. What about your own place? Your cattle? I've got a good foreman who can handle things for a few days. Besides, his smile was gentle but determined. There's nowhere I'd rather be than right here, making sure you're safe. That evening, as Jake settled into the barn loft with blankets and provisions, Sarah prepared dinner for two for the first time since Thomas's death. The simple act of cooking for someone else, of setting two places at her small table, filled her with unexpected contentment. When she called Jake in for the meal, he approached the cabin with obvious reluctance, as if crossing the threshold represented a line he wasn't certain he should cross. It's just dinner, Sarah said gently, understanding his hesitation. You can't very well protect me on an empty stomach. They ate by lamplight, talking quietly of safe subjects while outside the October wind rattled the windows and reminded them of the approaching winter. Jake complimented her cooking with genuine appreciation, told stories of his own disastrous attempts at domestic tasks that made her laugh until her sides ached. It had been so long since she'd laughed like that, so long since she'd felt the simple pleasure of good company and warm food shared with someone who cared about her welfare. You know, Jake said as Sarah served coffee and the apple pie she'd baked that afternoon, I've been thinking about those dreams you and Thomas had for this place. The garden, the chickens, maybe some fruit trees along the creek. They're good dreams, Sarah, worth fighting for. Are they? Sometimes I wonder if I'm just being stubborn, trying to hold on to something that was never really mine to begin with. She gazed around the small cabin, seeing both its potential and its limitations. Thomas had such grand plans, but he was always better at dreaming than doing. Half the things he wanted to accomplish were beyond our means. Dreams have a way of changing shape, Jake observed, growing into something different than what we first imagined, but no less valuable for the transformation. There was something in his tone that made Sarah look at him more closely, seeing in his weathered features a longing that matched her own. What are your dreams, Jake? What do you see when you look toward the future? He was quiet for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I see a home where laughter echoes through the rooms. I see gardens growing wild with flowers as well as vegetables. I see children playing in the yard while their parents watch from the porch, grateful for simple blessings. He looked directly at her then, his blue eyes intense with unspoken emotion. I see a woman brave enough to build a life worth living, strong enough to defend what she loves, kind enough to make a house into a home. Sarah felt her breath catch, understanding the implicit invitation in his words. He was offering her more than protection, more than companionship. He was offering her a future built on partnership rather than dependence, a chance to create something new from the ashes of what she'd lost. Jake, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I know it's too soon, he said quickly, rising from his chair as if to flee from his own boldness. I know you're still grieving, still finding your way. I don't expect anything, Sarah. I just wanted you to know that when you're ready, if you're ever ready, there's a man here who would count himself blessed to stand beside you. Before she could respond, he was moving toward the door, clearly intending to retreat to the safety of the barn. But Sarah rose as well, her hand reaching out to catch his arm. "Don't go," she said softly. "Not yet." He turned back to her, and in the lamplight she could see the careful hope in his eyes, the vulnerability he usually kept hidden beneath his steady competence. Without conscious thought, she stepped closer, drawn by an impulse that overrode all considerations of propriety and timing. "Sarah." He breathed her name like a prayer. "I know it's complicated," she whispered. "I know there are a dozen reasons why we should wait, should be sensible. But Jake, when those men rode up this morning, when I thought I might die without ever telling you." She took another step closer, close enough to see the pulse beating at the base of his throat. Life is too short and too uncertain to waste time on might-have-beens. For a moment they stood frozen, balanced on the knife's edge between restraint and surrender. Then Jake's hand rose to cup her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with infinite tenderness. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice rough with barely controlled emotion. Instead of answering with words, Sarah rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his, a kiss that tasted of coffee and possibility, and the courage to embrace an uncertain future. Jake's arms came around her, pulling her close as he deepened the kiss with a passion carefully held in check for weeks. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Sarah remained in the circle of his arms, marveling at how right it felt to be held by this quiet cowboy who'd shown her how to defend herself, and then defended her heart as well. "I should still sleep in the barn," Jake said reluctantly, his forehead resting against hers. "Should and want to are different things entirely," Sarah replied, her fingers tracing the strong line of his jaw. "Sarah McKenna, you're going to be the death of me," he murmured, but his smile took any sting from the words. "I certainly hope not," she replied with a boldness that surprised them both. "I have plans for you, Jake Donovan. Big plans that require you to stay very much alive." Sarah woke before dawn to the sound of distant gunfire, sharp cracks that echoed across the prairie like deadly thunder. Jake was already moving, rolling from his bedroll on the cabin floor where he'd finally compromised between propriety and proximity. His rifle was in his hands before his eyes were fully open, every line of his body taut with alertness. "Stay down," he whispered, moving to the window and peering carefully through a gap in the curtains. Shots came from the direction of the creek. Could be hunters, but probably not, Sarah finished, reaching for her own Winchester with hands that were surprisingly steady. The lessons of the past weeks had become instinct, her body responding to danger with trained competence rather than paralyzing fear. More shots rang out, closer now, followed by the thunder of hoofbeats and men's voices raised in anger or excitement. Jake's jaw tightened as he recognized the sounds of pursuit, of hunters closing in on cornered prey. "Those rustlers," he said grimly. "Sounds like the sheriff's posse finally caught up with them." Through the pre-dawn darkness, they could see muzzle flashes lighting up the creek bottom like deadly fireflies. The battle was fierce but brief, ending with a final volley followed by ominous silence. Sarah and Jake waited tensely, weapons ready, unsure whether the approaching riders would be friends or enemies. The answer came with the sound of familiar voices, Sheriff Morrison's distinctive drawl cutting through the morning air as he called instructions to his men. Sarah sagged with relief, only then realizing how rigidly she'd been holding herself. "It's over," Jake said, lowering his rifle. "They got them." An hour later, Sheriff Morrison himself rode up to the cabin, his weathered face grim with the aftermath of violence. "2 of the rustlers were dead," he reported, cut down in a running gunfight near the creek. Wade Collins had been taken alive but wounded, and would face trial in Dodge City for cattle theft and assault. "Found your missing stock in their camp," the sheriff told Sarah. "Every head accounted for, plus cattle stolen from the Morrisons and Pattersons. You'll have them back by afternoon." As the sheriff prepared to leave, he fixed Jake with a steady stare that held both gratitude and assessment. "Mighty convenient, you being here when trouble came calling. Folks might start to talk." "Let them talk," Jake replied calmly. "I sleep better knowing Mrs. McKenna is safe." "That's what I figured you'd say." The sheriff's smile was knowing but not unkind. "Word of advice, son. This territory's got more preachers than it knows what to do with. Might be time to find one." After the sheriff left, Sarah and Jake stood together on the porch, watching the sun rise over the prairie that had so recently echoed with gunfire. The danger was past, the rustlers captured or killed, but the implications of the sheriff's words hung heavy between them. "He's right, you know," Jake said quietly, "about the talking. Your reputation." "My reputation is my own concern," Sarah interrupted firmly. I'm not some fragile flower who wilts at the first breath of gossip. No, Jake agreed, turning to face her with eyes full of admiration. You're the strongest woman I've ever known. But this is a small territory, Sarah. People remember things, pass judgment, make life difficult for those who don't conform to their expectations. Sarah considered this, understanding the wisdom in his words while chafing at the constraints they represented. In the space of a few weeks, she'd learned to shoot, face down armed men, and discovered that her heart wasn't as frozen as she'd believed. The thought of retreating back into the safety of conventional widowhood held no appeal whatsoever. What are you suggesting? She asked. Jake removed his hat, running nervous fingers through his hair in the gesture she'd come to love. I'm suggesting that if we're going to build a future together, we should do it properly, with vows and blessings and the whole community's support. It wasn't exactly a proposal, but it was close enough to make Sarah's heart skip a beat. The idea of marriage, so soon after Thomas's death, should have felt like betrayal. Instead, it felt like coming home. Is that what you want? She asked. A wife who can outshoot most men in the territory? I want you, Jake replied simply. However you come, whatever skills you bring to the partnership, I want to wake up every morning knowing you're safe, knowing we're building something together that will last. Before Sarah could respond, the sound of approaching riders drew their attention to the trail. This time, however, the visitors were clearly peaceful. Martha Brennan from Clearwater, accompanied by her husband Bill and their 2 young children. The family had heard about the morning's excitement and come to check on Sarah's welfare. Martha's sharp eyes took in the domestic scene instantly. Jake's bedroll still visible through the open cabin door. The easy familiarity between him and Sarah. The glow of happiness that no amount of propriety could completely hide. Sarah McKenna, Martha said with a smile that held equal parts affection and mischief. You look like a woman with news to share. Do I? Sarah replied, her own smile bright enough to rival the morning sundae. Indeed you do. And Jake Donovan, you look like a man who's finally found what he's been searching for. Jake's grin was answer enough, and Martha clapped her hands together with delight. Well then, I suppose we'd better start planning a wedding. Can't have you 2 shocking the good people of Kansas with your improper arrangements. Martha, Sarah protested, but her laughter took any sting from the rebuke. Don't you Martha me, young lady. I've been waiting years for you to show some sense about finding yourself a good man. Now that you have, we're going to do this properly. As Martha began outlining plans for a ceremony that would satisfy both tradition and the territory's need for social order, Sarah caught Jake's eye and saw her own happiness reflected there. The morning had brought an end to one threat, and the beginning of something new and wonderful. The rustlers were gone, her cattle were safe, and she was about to embark on a future that promised partnership rather than loneliness, strength rather than dependence. As she listened to Martha's enthusiastic planning, Sarah felt a deep sense of rightness settle into her bones. This was what Thomas would have wanted for her. Not a lifetime of mourning, but the courage to embrace new love when it appeared. And Jake Donovan, with his patient teaching and quiet strength, had shown her that it was possible to honor the past while building something beautiful from its ashes. 2 weeks later, on a crisp November morning when the prairie grass had turned to gold and the sky stretched endless and blue above the Kansas plains, Sarah McKenna became Sarah Donovan in a ceremony that would be talked about for years throughout the territory. The wedding took place in the small wooden church in Clearwater, with half the county in attendance and Martha Brennan orchestrating every detail with the efficiency of a military commander. Sarah wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved in tissue paper and altered to fit her slender frame. The ivory silk had yellowed slightly with age, but the intricate lacework remained pristine, and when Jake saw her walking down the aisle on Bill Brennan's arm, his expression of wonder made every woman present sigh with romantic satisfaction. Jake had cleaned up remarkably well for the occasion, his usual work clothes replaced by a black suit borrowed from the town banker, and a string tie that Martha had insisted upon despite his protests. But it was the look in his eyes as Sarah approached that truly transformed him, a combination of love and gratitude and protective tenderness that made the simple cowboy appear almost noble. Reverend Palmer, imported specially from Dodge City for the occasion, performed the ceremony with appropriate solemnity while secretly marveling at the unusual circumstances that had brought these 2 together. It wasn't often that he married a widow who'd learned to outshoot most of the men in his congregation, or a bachelor who'd courted his bride by teaching her to handle firearms. When Jake slipped the simple gold band onto Sarah's finger, she felt a rush of emotion that had nothing to do with duty or convenience. and everything to do with the deep contentment of finding her proper place in the world. This wasn't the desperate passion of youth, but something richer and more enduring. The love between two people who'd found in each other the missing pieces of themselves. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Palmer declared, his voice carrying clearly through the packed church. "You may kiss your bride." Jake's kiss was gentle and reverent, appropriate for the public setting but promising more intimate celebrations to come. When they turned to face their friends and neighbors as man and wife, the church erupted in cheers and applause that could be heard clear across the prairie. The reception was held in the church social hall, with tables groaning under the weight of contributed dishes and the territory's finest musicians providing entertainment. Sarah found herself swept from conversation to conversation, accepting congratulations and advice from women who'd known her as Thomas's shy wife and were clearly amazed by her transformation into Jake's confident partner. "You look happy," observed Mrs. Patterson, whose husband had been among those who'd lost cattle to the rustlers. "Truly happy, not just content." "I am," Sarah replied, watching Jake across the room as he accepted good-natured ribbing from the other men about his rapid courtship. "I never thought I could be again. But the heart has its own wisdom," Mrs. Patterson finished with a knowing smile. "Thomas was a good man, dear. But he saw you as something precious to be protected. Jake sees you as someone strong enough to stand beside him as an equal." It was an astute observation, and Sarah found herself nodding in agreement. With Thomas, she'd been a cherished possession, valued, but not truly trusted with important decisions. With Jake, she felt like a full partner, her opinions sought and respected, her capabilities acknowledged and appreciated. Late in the afternoon, as the celebration showed no signs of waning, Jake appeared at Sarah's elbow with a conspiratorial grin. "Ready to escape, Mrs. Donovan?" The sound of her new name sent a thrill through her that she hoped wasn't too obvious to the watching crowd. "Lead the way, Mr. Donovan." They slipped away from the festivities and climbed into Jake's wagon, which had been decorated with ribbons and tin cans by his well-meaning friends. The noise was tremendous as they drove through Clearwater's main street, but Sarah found herself laughing with pure joy at the ridiculous spectacle they made. "Where are we going?" she asked as Jake turned the wagon away from both their properties and toward the open prairie. "Somewhere special," he replied mysteriously. "Somewhere I've been saving for the right occasion." They drove for an hour through rolling grassland, following faint cattle trails and creek beds toward a destination Sarah couldn't imagine. Finally, Jake stopped the wagon atop a low hill that commanded a view of the entire territory, from the distant mountains to the endless sea of grass that stretched beyond the horizon. "This is it," he said, helping her down from the wagon seat. "The place where I want to build our home." Sarah looked around in wonder, seeing immediately what had drawn him to this spot. The hill was high enough to provide security and good drainage, but sheltered enough to offer protection from the winter winds. A small creek meandered through the valley below, providing water for both household use and livestock. Rich soil spoke of good farming potential, while the vast grasslands promised excellent grazing. "It's beautiful," she breathed, already envisioning the house they could build here, the gardens she could plant, the life they could create together. "There's more," Jake said, pulling a folded paper from his coat pocket. "I bought this section last week, all 640 acres, from the creek to the ridge line. Thought we might need room to grow." Sarah stared at the deed, understanding the magnitude of what he was offering. This wasn't just land. It was a future, a foundation for the dreams they'd both harbored but never dared to speak aloud. "Jake," she whispered, overwhelmed by the scope of his vision. "I know your cabin holds memories of Thomas," he said gently. "Good memories that deserve to be honored. But I thought we might want to start fresh, build something that belongs to both of us from the beginning." It was a generous gesture, one that acknowledged her past while offering her a future unencumbered by ghosts. Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes as she contemplated the gift he was giving her. Not just land, but the chance to create something entirely new. "What about your place?" she asked. "Your cattle? We'll keep it as a working ranch, hire someone to manage the day-to-day operations. This will be our home, our sanctuary." He gestured toward the valley spread below them. "I see fruit trees along the creek, a big garden behind the house, maybe a separate cabin for guests or children, if we're blessed with them." The mention of children made Sarah's breath catch. At 28, she wasn't too old to bear children, but the subject had always been a source of quiet pain with Thomas. His grand dreams had included a large family, But month after month had passed without the blessing of pregnancy, and gradually the subject had become too tender to discuss. "Jake," she began, uncertain how to voice her fears. "Whatever comes, we'll face it together," he said, understanding her unspoken concerns. "Children would be a joy, but you're all I need to make my life complete." As the sun began to set, painting the prairie in shades of gold and crimson, Jake spread a blanket on the hilltop, and they shared a simple meal he'd packed for the occasion. They talked quietly of their plans for the land, the type of house they wanted to build, the life they hoped to create in this peaceful valley. "I never imagined this," Sarah said as stars began to appear in the darkening sky. "6 months ago, I was just trying to survive each day. Now you're planning a future worth living," Jake finished, pulling her closer against the evening chill. "We're planning a future worth living," Sarah corrected, snuggling against his warmth. "I couldn't do this alone, Jake." "I wouldn't want to. You'll never have to," he promised, his lips brushing against her temple. "We're partners now, in everything that matters." As they sat together beneath the vast prairie sky, Sarah marveled at the unexpected turns her life had taken. From grieving widow to confident markswoman to beloved wife, all in the span of a few short weeks. The future stretched before them like the endless grassland, full of possibility and promise. Tomorrow they would begin the work of building their dream home on this beautiful hilltop. But tonight, in the peaceful darkness with her husband's arms around her, Sarah Donovan was content simply to count her blessings and give thanks for the second chance at happiness that had arrived in the form of a patient cowboy who'd taught her to shoot and, in the process, taught her to love again. Spring came early to the Kansas territory that year, painting the prairie in vibrant greens and filling the air with the sweet scent of wildflowers. Sarah stood in the doorway of the half-finished house that was rising on Jake's chosen hilltop, watching her husband and their hired crew raise the walls that would soon shelter their growing family. The framework stood sturdy and true against the endless sky, a testament to Jake's careful planning and the skill of the carpenters he'd brought in from Dodge City. The past 5 months had been a whirlwind of activity. They'd spent the winter months in Jake's original cabin, planning every detail of their new home and ordering materials to be freighted in come spring. Sarah had thrown herself into the project with enthusiasm, her natural eye for design complementing Jake's practical knowledge of construction. Together, they'd created plans for a house that would be both comfortable and impressive, large enough for the family they hoped to have while maintaining the warmth and intimacy they both treasured. But the house wasn't the only thing growing that spring. Sarah's hand moved instinctively to her still flat belly, where new life was beginning to stir. The doctor in Dodge City had confirmed what she'd suspected for weeks. She was carrying Jake's child, due to arrive with the autumn harvest. The news had filled them both with joy tinged by nervous anticipation, particularly given her previous struggles with conception. "The bedroom walls are going up faster than expected," Jake called from his position atop the frame, his voice carrying easily across the construction site. "We might be able to move in by midsummer if the weather holds." "Good," Sarah called back, her smile bright enough to rival the spring sunshine. "This baby isn't going to wait for us to finish decorating." The announcement of their coming child had been met with celebration throughout the territory, but nowhere more enthusiastically than in the small community that had grown up around their hilltop. Martha Brennan had appointed herself chief advisor on all matters relating to pregnancy and childbirth, arriving weekly with new advice and usually staying to help with whatever domestic tasks Sarah was attempting to master. For Sarah had discovered that managing a household of this scope required skills she'd never needed in her small cabin with Thomas. There were hired hands to feed, visitors to entertain, correspondence to maintain with suppliers and contractors. Jake had insisted on hiring a housekeeper to ease her burden, but Sarah took pride in mastering these new challenges herself. The greatest challenge, however, had come from an unexpected source. 3 weeks earlier, a wagon had appeared on their trail bearing an elderly Cheyenne woman and her grandson, both clearly in distress. The woman, who spoke only a few words of English, was sick with fever, while the boy appeared to be suffering from malnutrition and exhaustion. Jake's immediate instinct had been to offer aid, despite the potential complications of sheltering Indians in a territory where tensions between white settlers and native tribes ran high. Sarah had supported his decision without hesitation, her own sense of humanity overriding any concerns about social conventions. "They're human beings in need of help," she'd said simply when Jake expressed worries about possible criticism from their neighbors. "That's all that matters." The woman, whose name they learned was Singing Bird, had been traveling to rejoin her tribe after visiting relatives on a distant reservation. Her grandson, Running Wolf, was perhaps 8 or 9 years old, with solemn dark eyes that seemed far too old for his young face. Both spoke some English, though Singing Bird was clearly more comfortable in her native tongue. Under Sarah's careful nursing, Singing Bird's fever had broken within a few days, but her recovery was slow. Running Wolf, initially suspicious and withdrawn, had gradually warmed to Sarah's gentle kindness and Jake's patient attempts at communication. The boy showed remarkable intelligence and curiosity, particularly about the construction project taking place around them. "He watches everything," Jake observed one evening as they sat on their temporary porch, watching Running Wolf study the carpenter's techniques with intense concentration. "Sees how things fit together, remembers every detail. Reminds me of myself at that age, always trying to understand how things worked." "His grandmother says he has the gift of seeing," Sarah replied, her voice thoughtful. Whatever that means in their culture, the presence of their Indian guests had indeed raised eyebrows among some neighbors, but the majority of the community had accepted Jake and Sarah's explanation that Christian charity demanded no less. Sheriff Morrison had ridden out to check on the situation, ostensibly to ensure that local laws were being observed, but really to satisfy his own curiosity about the unusual household arrangement. "Singing Bird and her grandson are welcome to stay as long as they need," Jake had told the sheriff firmly. "They're under our protection. No problem with that, as long as they're not causing trouble," Morrison had replied. "Though I'd keep a close eye on the boy. Indians that age sometimes run wild if they're not properly supervised." It was a comment that had irritated both Sarah and Jake, particularly since Running Wolf had shown nothing but courtesy and helpfulness since his arrival. The boy had appointed himself Sarah's unofficial guardian, appearing at her side whenever she attempted any task that might be considered strenuous, his young face grave with concern for her condition. Now, as she watched the house take shape, Sarah reflected on how much their lives had expanded beyond anything she'd imagined on that October day when Jake first offered to teach her to shoot. They were no longer just a husband and wife building a home together. They were the center of a small community that included hired hands, occasional visitors, and now their Indian guests. "Mrs. Donovan," a young voice said behind her, and Sarah turned to see Running Wolf approaching with his characteristic quiet dignity. He'd taken to using her married name with careful formality, though in private moments she'd heard him call her by the Cheyenne word that Singing Bird had told her meant kind heart. "What is it, Running Wolf?" "Grandmother says to tell you that the white flowers by the creek are ready for picking. She says they make good medicine for women who carry babies." Sarah smiled at the boy's careful translation. Singing Bird had appointed herself as an additional source of pregnancy advice, sharing knowledge passed down through generations of Cheyenne women. Some of her suggestions had seemed strange to Sarah's European sensibilities, but others had proven remarkably effective. "Tell your grandmother I'm grateful for her wisdom," Sarah replied. "Would you like to come pick flowers with me?" Running Wolf's solemn expression brightened slightly. "Yes, but I will carry the basket. Jake says I must help you with heavy things." As they walked toward the creek together, Sarah marveled at the unexpected turns her life continued to take. She was learning as much from Singing Bird about herbal medicine and natural healing as she'd learned from Jake about self-defense. Running Wolf was teaching her simple Cheyenne words while she helped him improve his English. The house rising behind them would shelter not just her own family, but anyone else who needed sanctuary in this vast, often unforgiving land. It wasn't the quiet domestic life she'd once imagined, but it was something richer and more meaningful. A life of purpose and service, of growth and discovery, of love that extended beyond the boundaries of blood and culture to embrace all who needed shelter and care. And at the center of it all was Jake, the quiet cowboy who'd seen in her not just a woman to be protected, but a partner capable of building something greater than either of them could have achieved alone. The first snows of winter were dusting the completed house when the riders appeared on the horizon, their approach marked by a dust cloud that spoke of urgent purpose. Sarah, now heavy with child and due within the month, watched from the large window of her kitchen as Jake emerged from the barn to meet the visitors. Even at a distance, she could see the tension in his posture, the way his hand moved instinctively toward the rifle that was never far from his reach. The delegation consisted of 5 men: Sheriff Morrison, a stranger in a black suit who carried himself with official authority, and 3 Cheyenne warriors in full tribal regalia. Sarah's heart clenched with sudden fear as she recognized the potential implications of such a mixed group. Since Singing Bird and Running Wolf had taken up residence in their home 8 months earlier, there had been whispers in town about the propriety of whites sheltering Indians, but nothing had prepared her for this formal visitation. Running Wolf, she called to the boy who was helping her prepare bread dough despite her protest that she could manage alone. Please fetch your grandmother. I think she'll want to hear this conversation. The boy's dark eyes were already wide with recognition as he looked out the window at the approaching delegation. One of the warriors was familiar to him. Sarah could see it in the sudden straightening of his spine, the way his hands clenched at his sides. That is my father, he said quietly. He has come to take us home. Sarah felt her heart sink even as she recognized the justice in such a claim. She'd known from the beginning that their guest's stay was temporary, that eventually, Singing Bird would be well enough to travel and the tribe would send for them. But over the months, she'd grown so attached to the elderly woman's gentle wisdom and the boy's eager curiosity that she'd allowed herself to hope they might choose to stay permanently. By the time the delegation reached the house, Singing Bird had emerged from her small room, dressed in her finest traditional clothing, and carrying herself with the dignity befitting an elder of her people. She spoke rapidly to the warriors in Cheyenne, her voice carrying both welcome and sadness. The conversation was brief but intense, filled with gestures toward the house and frequent glances at Sarah's obviously pregnant form. Jake appeared in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral as he addressed Sarah. The tribal council has sent representatives to escort Singing Bird and Running Wolf back to their people. They're grateful for the care we've provided, but they want their family members returned. Sarah nodded, understanding the necessity even as her heart ached at the thought of losing the companions who'd become so dear to her. She looked at Running Wolf, seeing in his young face a conflict that mirrored her own. The boy had thrived during his time with them, his English improving dramatically while he helped with daily tasks and absorbed lessons in reading and arithmetic that Sarah had begun providing during the long winter evenings. I understand, she said finally. When will you leave? The man in the black suit stepped forward, removing his hat with perfunctory politeness. Mrs. Donovan, I'm Agent Harrison from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. There are questions about the circumstances under which these Indians came to be residing on your property. Federal law requires that tribal members remain on designated reservations unless they have specific permission to travel. Jake's jaw tightened at the bureaucratic tone. They came to us sick and starving. Were we supposed to let them die to satisfy some government regulation? Your humanitarian impulses are commendable, Harrison replied coolly. But harboring Indians without proper authorization is a serious matter. There will need to be an investigation to ensure that no laws were broken. What laws? Sarah demanded, her pregnancy-enhanced emotions giving edge to her voice. The law that says we should show kindness to those in need? The law that says we should shelter the homeless and feed the hungry? Agent Harrison's expression suggested he was unaccustomed to being challenged by women, particularly pregnant ones. Mrs. Donovan, I appreciate your passion, but these matters are more complex than you understand. Relations between whites and Indians must be carefully managed to prevent incidents that could lead to violence. The only violence I see here, Jake interjected quietly, is the violence of bureaucracy trying to separate people who've found peace together. Sheriff Morrison, who'd remained silent during the exchange, finally spoke up. Agent Harrison, I've been watching this situation for months, and I can testify that the Donovans have done nothing but provide Christian charity to folks in need. No laws were broken, no incidents occurred, no complaints were filed. Maybe we should focus on real problems instead of creating new ones. The Cheyenne warriors had listened to this exchange with impressive patience, but now the eldest stepped forward and spoke directly to Singing Bird in their native tongue. Her reply was lengthy and emphatic, punctuated by gestures toward Sarah and the house around them. What is she saying? Sarah asked Running Wolf, who had been translating quietly under his breath. She tells them that you saved her life, the boy replied, his young voice thick with emotion. She says you are sister to her heart, that your kindness has healed wounds deeper than the sickness in her body. She asks the council to remember this debt. The warrior's response was gentle but firm, and Sarah didn't need translation to understand its meaning. Gratitude was one thing, but tribal law and federal regulations were another. Singing Bird and Running Wolf would return with their people, regardless of personal attachments formed during their stay. But then Singing Bird spoke again, her voice rising with passionate conviction. This time her words were directed not at the warriors but at Agent Harrison, delivered in careful but determined English. "My grandson learns much here," she said, her accent thick but her meaning clear. "Learns white man's writing, white man's numbers. These skills help our people in the days coming. I ask permission for him to stay, to finish learning, then return to teach others." The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from a campfire, unexpected and controversial. Agent Harrison's expression showed his distaste for such an irregular arrangement, while the Cheyenne warriors exchanged glances that suggested the proposal wasn't entirely without precedent. "That's not how these things are typically handled," Harrison said slowly. "Maybe it's time for new ways of handling things," Jake suggested. "The boy wants to learn. We're willing to teach him. He could spend summers with his tribe and winters here, getting educated. Seems like it would benefit everyone." Running Wolf himself had remained silent during the adults' discussion, but now he stepped forward with the dignity that seemed natural to his people regardless of age. "I wish to stay and learn," he said clearly, his English now fluent enough to carry his meaning without doubt. "I will not forget my people or my traditions, but I want to understand the white man's ways so I can help build bridges between our worlds." The wisdom in such a young voice surprised everyone present, including Agent Harrison, whose bureaucratic certainties seemed to waver in the face of such articulate determination. What followed was an hour of complex negotiation involving federal regulations, tribal customs, and simple human decency. In the end, it was Singing Bird's status as an elder and her passionate advocacy for her grandson's education that tipped the balance. Running Wolf would be allowed to remain with the Donovans through the school year, with the understanding that he would spend summers with his tribe and eventually return to serve as a bridge between the two cultures. As the delegation prepared to leave, taking Singing Bird but leaving Running Wolf behind, Sarah felt her emotions threaten to overwhelm her. The elderly woman had become not just a guest but a grandmother figure, her gentle wisdom helping Sarah prepare for motherhood, while her presence provided a connection to traditions far older than the young territory of Kansas. "You have been daughter to me," Singing Bird said as they embraced, her weathered hands gentle on Sarah's swollen belly. "This child will be blessed, will grow strong between two worlds and help heal old wounds." "I'll miss you," Sarah whispered, tears flowing freely down her cheeks. "Hearts that have touched do not forget," Singing Bird replied. "Distance cannot break bonds forged in kindness." As the delegation rode away into the gathering dusk, Sarah stood with Jake and Running Wolf on their porch, watching until the riders disappeared into the vast prairie. The house felt empty without Singing Bird's quiet presence, but the boy's decision to stay provided some comfort. "Are you certain this is what you want?" Sarah asked Running Wolf, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Yes," he replied without hesitation. "Grandmother taught me that wisdom comes from understanding many ways of seeing the world. I want to learn your ways, so I can help my people understand them too." Jake nodded approvingly. "Then we'd better get you properly enrolled in school come spring. Mrs. Donovan can continue your reading lessons through the winter, but you'll need formal education if you're going to serve as a bridge between our peoples." As they went inside to prepare dinner, Sarah reflected on the day's events. They'd gained formal recognition of their right to provide sanctuary to those in need, but lost a dear friend in the process. They'd taken on the responsibility of educating a young mind that might someday help prevent the conflicts that seemed inevitable between expanding white settlement and displaced tribal peoples. It wasn't the quiet domestic life she'd once imagined, but it was something more important, a life of purpose that extended beyond personal happiness to embrace larger questions of justice and understanding. And with her first child due within weeks and Running Wolf now officially part of their household, Sarah knew their real adventures were just beginning. On a crisp October morning, exactly 1 year after Jake Donovan had first offered to teach her to shoot, Sarah stood once again on her porch, but everything else about her world had changed beyond recognition. In her arms, she cradled her month-old daughter, Elizabeth, whose dark hair and blue eyes promised to be a perfect blend of her parents' features. Beside her, Running Wolf practiced his penmanship on a slate board, his tongue poking out slightly in concentration as he copied passages from the McGuffey reader that had become his favorite text. The house behind them was warm and welcoming, filled with the sounds of daily life that had once seemed impossible to imagine. Jake's voice carried from the kitchen where he was preparing lunch, occasionally interrupted by the laughter of the 3 cowboys who worked their expanded ranch and had become as much family as employees. Through the open windows came the sounds of cattle lowing in the distance and chickens clucking in the coop that Running Wolf had helped Jake build during the summer. "Mrs. Sarah," Running Wolf said, looking up from his slate with the serious expression that seemed permanently etched on his young features. "I have been thinking about the letter we should write to grandmother." Sarah smiled, shifting baby Elizabeth to a more comfortable position. The weekly letters to Singing Bird had become a cherished tradition, with Running Wolf dictating news in English while Sarah wrote, then translating the essential parts into Cheyenne symbols that he was teaching her to recognize. "What should we tell her this week?" Sarah asked. "That Elizabeth grows strong and wise, that the harvest was good, that the new calves are healthy." Running Wolf paused, his dark eyes thoughtful. "And that the people from town still come to ask your advice about difficult things." It was true. Somehow, in the space of a single year, Sarah had gained a reputation throughout the territory as a woman of wisdom and compassion. People brought her their problems, sought her counsel on everything from difficult childbirths to family disputes to questions about dealing fairly with the few remaining Indian tribes in the region. Her own transformation from grieving widow to confident community leader still amazed her, but she'd grown into the role with the same determination she'd once applied to learning marksmanship. "Mama," a small voice called from inside the house, and Sarah's heart warmed at the sound. It was Running Wolf, using the name he'd adopted for her over the summer when formal titles had begun to feel too distant for their close relationship. He'd never forgotten his Cheyenne heritage, but he'd also embraced his place in their unconventional family with wholehearted commitment. "Yes, sweetheart. Jake says lunch is ready, and that the new neighbors want to meet you." Sarah looked toward the trail that led to their hilltop and saw a wagon approaching, loaded with household goods and accompanied by a man on horseback. New settlers were still arriving in the territory, drawn by reports of good land and peaceful communities. Most stopped by the Donovan place eventually, knowing they'd find helpful advice and a warm welcome regardless of their circumstances. "Another family looking to start over," she murmured to Elizabeth, who gurgled contentedly in response. As the wagon drew closer, Sarah could see it carried a young woman and several children, their clothes worn but clean, their faces showing the mixture of hope and apprehension common to all pioneers. The man riding alongside appeared to be the husband and father, his weathered features suggesting he'd seen hard times but hadn't lost his determination to build something better. Jake emerged from the house, wiping his hands on a dish towel, his face breaking into the welcoming smile that had first captured Sarah's heart. In the year since their marriage, he'd grown even more handsome in her eyes, his natural kindness deepened by the responsibilities of family and community leadership that he'd shouldered with characteristic grace. "Afternoon, folks," Jake called as the wagon stopped before their porch. "I'm Jake Donovan, and this is my wife Sarah. Welcome to our part of Kansas." "Name's Henry Walsh," the man replied, removing his hat with careful politeness. "This is my wife Mary and our 4 children. We heard in Dodge City that you folks might be able to advise us about available land in these parts." "Of course," Sarah said, standing with practiced ease despite the baby in her arms. "Please, come up on the porch and rest yourselves. We were just about to have lunch, and there's plenty for everyone." It was a ritual she'd performed dozens of times over the past year, the automatic hospitality that had become second nature. But as the Walsh family climbed down from their wagon, Sarah noticed something that made her pause. Mary Walsh moved with the careful slowness of a woman in the early stages of pregnancy, while the children's thin faces suggested they'd been traveling on short rations for some time. "Running Wolf," Sarah said quietly, "please ask Jake to set extra places for lunch, and see if we have any of that milk left from this morning's milking." The boy nodded and slipped inside, his movements quick and efficient. Over the months, he'd become Sarah's able assistant in the countless acts of hospitality their home provided, understanding without being told what was needed in each situation. As they shared lunch around the large table Jake had built to accommodate their extended household, the Walsh family's story emerged in fragments. They'd lost their farm in Missouri to drought and debt, had spent their last savings on the wagon and supplies for the journey west. Henry had skills as a blacksmith, a trade much needed in the growing territory, while Mary had experience as a seamstress and teacher. "The children haven't had proper schooling in months," Mary confessed, her eyes dark with worry as she watched her youngest, a girl of perhaps 6, devour her bowl of stew with obvious hunger. "I try to teach them what I can, but with all the traveling and uncertainty." "Education is precious," Sarah agreed, thinking of Running Wolf's eager pursuit of knowledge. and her own plans to establish a proper school in their growing community. Perhaps you'd consider staying in this area? We could use a blacksmith, and I've been hoping to find someone qualified to help with teaching the local children. The offer was made spontaneously, but Sarah saw immediately that it was the right thing to do. The Walsh family needed security and community, while their skills would benefit everyone in the territory. It was the kind of mutual assistance that made frontier life possible. That's mighty generous, Henry said carefully, but we wouldn't want to impose. No imposition, Jake assured him. There's a section of land about 2 miles south that's perfect for a smithy, close to the creek for water power and near enough to town for easy access. The current owner's been looking for a buyer who'd actually work the land rather than just speculate on it. As the afternoon progressed, plans began to take shape with the easy efficiency of people accustomed to solving practical problems. Jake would introduce Henry to the landowner and vouch for his character. Sarah would help Mary establish contact with the other women in the community who could provide both friendship and customers for her sewing skills. The children would join Running Wolf in the informal school that had grown up around their kitchen table, at least until a proper schoolhouse could be built. "Why are you doing this for strangers?" Mary asked as the women cleaned up after lunch, her voice thick with grateful emotion. "We have nothing to offer in return. You have skills we need and children who deserve education," Sarah replied simply. "Besides, we were strangers here once too. Someone helped us when we needed it most, and now we pass that kindness forward." It was the truth, though Sarah knew it was only part of the truth. The deeper reality was that helping others had become essential to her own happiness, that the sense of purpose she'd found in serving her community had given her life meaning beyond anything she'd imagined possible. As evening approached and the Walsh family prepared to head toward Clearwater to spend the night at the boarding house, Sarah stood on her porch holding Elizabeth while Jake and Running Wolf helped load their wagon with supplies from their own stores. The scene filled her with profound contentment, this daily evidence of the life they'd built together through determination, courage, and simple human kindness. "You know," Jake said as he joined her on the porch, slipping his arm around her waist with familiar ease, "when I first offered to teach you to shoot, I never imagined it would lead to all this." Sarah leaned into his warmth, remembering that terrifying October morning when 3 rustlers had threatened everything she held dear. The woman who'd stood trembling with a rifle in her hands seemed like a stranger now, though Sarah knew she was still there, hidden beneath layers of confidence and experience. "I thought I was just learning to defend myself," she said softly. "I never realized I was learning to defend something much larger." "What's that?" "Hope," Sarah replied, watching Running Wolf wave goodbye to the Walsh children, with the easy friendship that came naturally to him. The hope that people can be better than their circumstances, that communities can be built on something stronger than fear, that the future can be shaped by courage rather than simply endured. Jake's arms tightened around her, his lips brushing against her temple in a gesture of complete understanding. And to think it all started with a widow asking a cowboy to teach her how to shoot. As the Walsh wagon disappeared into the gathering dusk, Sarah reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought her to this moment. A year ago, she'd been alone and afraid, struggling simply to survive in a harsh and unforgiving land. Now she was surrounded by family, both biological and chosen. Her home had become a beacon of hope for travelers and settlers, and her influence extended throughout a community that looked to her for guidance and wisdom. The rifle that had once terrified her now hung over the mantelpiece, a symbol not of violence but of the strength to protect what mattered most. The skills Jake had taught her had grown beyond marksmanship to encompass leadership, diplomacy, and the complex art of building bridges between different worlds. But most importantly, she'd learned that love could bloom even in the darkest soil, that hearts broken by loss could heal stronger than before, and that the courage to help others was often the key to finding one's own path to happiness. As stars began to appear in the vast prairie sky, Sarah Donovan stood on her porch holding her sleeping daughter, surrounded by the husband who'd taught her to aim for more than targets, and the boy who'd shown her that family could transcend the boundaries of blood and culture. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new travelers in need of assistance, new opportunities to make a difference in lives beyond her own. But tonight, she was content to count her blessings and marvel at the unexpected ways that grace could enter a life, transforming fear into courage, loneliness into love, and a simple request for shooting lessons into a future more beautiful than any dream she'd ever dared to imagine. The prairie wind whispered through the grass around their hilltop home, carrying with it the promise of seasons yet to come and stories yet to be written. And Sarah Donovan, who'd once thought her story had ended with Thomas's death, now understood that it had only been waiting for the right moment to begin again.